So, welcome, Raghav. Really nice to have you
Thank
with
you.
us. Very,
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
very excited to hear about your new book and your work. And as we have done in the past, we will you will lead us in the seminar. I would appreciate if you introduce yourself to people here, yeah, and tell them a little bit about your work and your background,
All
and then
right.
it's all yours. I will be taking note of questions from people in the chat. If there is anyone that wants to interrupt, please do, and we will be as much as possible engage in a conversation with Raghav. So thank you. It's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Angela. Thank you. It's an honor to address a gathering like this, and thank you all of you who have turned up to listen to me. I hope I can do justice to the time given to me. Um, so my background is that I, grew up in India, and I started my career working with a lot of marginalized and uh, poor kinds of communities. Spent about a decade in rural development, and then I shifted gears and I moved into organization development work in the corporate sector for a bit. Um, and what connected these experiences to me was the cultural sort of dimension of working with people. And along the way, I sort of got introduced to systems thinking in my own fashion. Some of us who were working together on a project at one point of time got introduced to Peter Senge, and we were very excited, and we drew a few systems dynamics maps of the situation that we were handling, and thereafter talking about a few basic systems principles. Two clients in organization development I was working with was sort of routine, but that got a fillip, that got an impetus when some years ago in 2012 I joined the doctoral program in systems thinking at the Hull University. And that was very, very enriching for me because it helped me bring together all my life experience. And So my thesis eventually got converted into a book that was published last October. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm trying a little bit of an unconventional kind of experiment. I don't know. It sort of came together this way yesterday when I was thinking about how to present and what to present. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of providing snapshots of three or four conceptual models which come together into an overall model in my book. And the idea is to present snapshots because obviously in the given time I cannot go into any very great detail about each of these pieces. They're all fairly complex pieces, but there's a rationale as to why I picked them up from various sources and why I put them together to talk about how we can sort of deepen our work in the systems field. Uh, Now, one caveat that I have to make right at the beginning is to say that I have very little understanding of cybernetics. I was supposed to spend the last couple of months, out of my own interest. I had wanted to delve into the topic a bit, but I was taken ill for this period, and it's just about the last week that I have become functional again. So that project did not happen, and so I know very little about cybernetics, but I have tried with my little understanding to sort of place what I'm going to say in the cybernetic context. So I'll just do that at the beginning and then go on to speak about my work without really using any cybernetics language. So that's what I plan to do. Um, so if that is all right, then we can go ahead. Yeah. So maybe I'll share screen now and start off with my presentation.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah.
So, why did it go into? Oops. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. So here we are. Right. So the topic that I'm presenting is what I call meta-rational ways of knowing, and um, a little way into the presentation, I will explain what I mean by this term. But to begin with, I would like to start by sharing three stories, three vignettes of experience. Um, these are significant because of what they brought to me and how they shaped my response to systems sciences. So the first story is in the early 90s, before we had uh, mobile phones and GPS and what have you. I was working with a tribal set of tribal farmers, a tribal community in Western India. Um, and it is a very mountainous terrain. We had proposed to set up an irrigation project, and this was a fairly large one, about 1.5 kilometers, square kilometers, about 350 acres, uh, involving about 65 farmers and around almost 2.5 kilometers of pipeline. And uh, so I had these friends from the city come in. The technology then was that you used what were called dumpy levels, a sort of telescope mounted on tripods, and then you measured the topography of the land. It was fairly laborious, intensive work. They spent about 4 or 5 months trying to map uh, the area and ascertain what would be the most optimal sort of design for the irrigation project. And the interesting thing is that at the end of these 5 months, the optimal design that came out was precisely what the illiterate village headman, a man who used to affix his thumbprint because he couldn't even sign, he had walked me through a transact on the very first day when he, opened his heart up and shared with me his dream of having this project. So he had taken me down to the lake bed and he said, "This is where we lift the water, and this is where the pipeline would go initially in this direction. And this would be the first point where we could offload water for all the western fields. And then it would branch off, and the main branch would go this way." He walked me down right up to the final point, and that was precisely what was repeated in the design provided by the engineers. Uh, my second story um, relates to an event that all of you are familiar with. In the recent past, the first major tsunami that struck was a 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which wreaked a lot of havoc in the Philippines and adjacent um, islands. But there was also these Andaman Islands, which is part of Indian territory, which suffered a fair amount of devastation. Now, in the Andaman Islands lived a certain very few hundreds of people of a certain tribe. Um, and the local governor, 2 days after the tsunami, reported back to New Delhi, to the central government, union government, that it looked like this tribe had been wiped out. There was no trace of a single person. Uh, 2 days further after that, 4 days after the tsunami, the chief of the tribe came and met the governor with a formal report accounting for every single person, elderly, invalid, infants, even all their cattle and goats and poultry, to say that each and every one was alive and safe and back in their respective villages and homes. Now, this was the first tsunami for which we had absolutely no warning. None of the weather systems of the world had anticipated this. Today, we have all of that. This was the first one in recent times which did not have any forewarning, but these people knew. And so they had taken away to the mountaintops and to a safe location, and they had stayed there for a couple of days until they were sure that they could get back to their homes. Now, my third story relates not to one but to several repeated experiences that I have had, as I have applied, theater techniques in organizational behavior. More properly, these are actor preparation techniques that I used. While a group of actors seek to prepare for staging or mounting a particular play. Then these are exercises that they undertake to foster a sort of heightened awareness and response to one another as a team, when they're on stage. And routinely and repeatedly in using this kind of activity with groups of people, whether they are students, whether they are corporate team members. We have, and of course, all the time in theater, anybody who's been in theater will tell you that we have experienced that people access information that seems impossible on a normal basis, that seems magical. Um, for example, one actor is reliving a memory of some event from her past, and the instruction is that she will only relive it in her mind, uh, expressing nothing whatsoever, speaking nothing, expressing nothing through her eyes, no gestures, nothing whatsoever. Her partner in the exercise seems to receive the entire narration inside her mind as if she is watching a video that's transmitted to her. The partner is often able to uh, tell us when this exercise is done, about such incredibly specific details as to the age of the person, the color of the walls of the room, the furniture that was there, or the whatever was this environment, maybe even the dress that somebody else who was in that event was wearing. Astonishing bits of detail come out from the other person's mind. you know um, Another exercise. We have 25 or 30 people being put through their paces, body work and whatever in preparation for theater. We suddenly assemble them to conduct an exercise which they have had no inkling of before. So we tell them to stand randomly in the room, blindfold them, and then they give instructions. The group is to count out serially from number one to number whatever, if there are 25 people, to number 25. The instruction is that at the word go, any one person would count out the number one. The next person, the person who next decides to say two, has to do so within 3 seconds. If no number is called out, if the next number is not called out within 3 seconds, then the game is cancelled and you go back to the start. If two people speak up at once, the game is cancelled, you go back to the start. Invariably, in any reasonably serious group, we have found that on the third or the fourth round, the group is able to complete this exercise. Sometimes the group is so astonished with this themselves, they refuse to believe this could have happened, and they say, "Can we repeat it?" And when they repeat it, it works once again. Not that they, following the same order in which people called out the numbers. It's just a completely different random uh, sequence of people, and yet it works. Um, So, I mean, there are any number of such exercises and activities. And the moot point is that in theater work, when you're using these kind of exercises, this kind of magic seems to happen routinely of accessing information that should not normally be accessible. So, what do these three stories indicate? I mean, is it just some kind of fiction that I'm making up? Is it voodoo? Is it mumbo jumbo? Or is there some useful common thread? So, my aim in today's talk is to share with you my take on the limits and possibilities of human understanding of complex human systems, human groups, social systems. And now, with whatever little I have understood about cybernetics, I want to locate this inquiry of mine on the canvas of cybernetics. So I believe, I gather that there are several concerns that cybernetics might have. Another first order cybernetics, as it is sometimes described, looks at purposive and goal oriented systems and tries to infer what are the communication and control mechanisms that make them work. And now, this is the way a colleague, a friend of mine, Anthony Hodgson, has interpreted that in this diagram. That there is an observer standing outside, there is a subject object split. The observer is looking at the subject and trying to make sense of it. In second order cybernetics, what we are looking at is actually observing the observer or the subject. Are we looking at, so how is this observer gathering information and organizing it to make meaning or to make sense? What is the epistemology involved? Now, I believe that recently there is emerging the third order cybernetics, which is observing the observing. This corresponds to an active cognition that Matsurana and Varela have talked about, that most people in the systems field are aware of. The biologists Humberto Maturana and Varela. Now, I have been very sort of deeply influenced by Maturana and Varela's work on enactive cognition. And I have tried to sort of break that down a little bit more into what is actually taking place when an active cognition happens. And that's a model that will present a moment later. So, I shared three stories with you, and then I tried to talk about where I'm placing my work in cybernetics. So, what is the connection? Now, what I have experienced with my work with the tribal farmers, or with diverse communities, often unlettered and marginalized, um, uh, fishermen, tribes of software engineers, um, artisans, performing artists. What I have found that these kinds of cultures, which are outside the Western mainstream, they seem to have epistemologies which are not actually simplistic; they are fairly sophisticated, and so in their manner, they are able to pick up hidden systemic structures, with their approaches. And a lot of my own work in organizational development has been informed by my professional incubation in an organization called Sumedis, who've developed an approach to group inquiry called human process inquiry. And what we have found in working in groups while doing collective inquiry within groups is that there is a certain sort of hidden dynamic with various kinds of phenomena, sometimes paradoxical phenomena and processes that happens in groups. Now, those of you who, if you have an acquaintance with individual psychology, you're aware of processes like, let's say, regression or dissociation, or whatever, various things in from the individual unconscious psyche, which create a behavior which outwardly doesn't seem to make sense. But if you know the hidden structure that's driving that behavior, then you know what's happening. And so it is with groups. You have phenomena like a collusion, where without any explicit uh, transaction, the entire group is working to certain directions, avoiding, say, moving in a particular direction and moving in some other direction. Or you can have scapegoating, where again the entire group, without any uh, formal understanding, suddenly begins to victimize one person in that group. So there are unconscious processes both at the individual level and at the collective level that operate. And it is when we encounter these kinds of phenomena, which are often paradoxical when you look at them out, from external uh, vantage point, that you find that rational approaches are inadequate. So at this point, I'll close my introduction and summarize my thoughts. It's these kind of additional added ways of knowing, uh, added to the rational approach, where you sense and pick up information patterns, through other modes, through affective modes, through looking at the emotions that are at play, or through looking at bodily sensations and so on, that add to deeper systemic understanding. And so when these approaches are added to the rational approaches, I call that meta-rational ways of knowing. These kinds of approaches, they what they do is that they use information that's available from uh, from the effective level, from what we call tacit or um, intuitive understanding. They use information that's available from bodily sensing. They use information that people seem to pick up in terms of what they call energy sensing. And it's the careful managing of these information inputs as well as the rational information inputs. How do you combine them? How do you triangulate? How do you calibrate amongst these, which leads to a deepened understanding of the systemic structures. So this is in some my statement or my offering. And what I will do now is not actually, I don't want to discuss these techniques and practices which allow us to access such information. They're plentiful. They're also there in, fields like action research, or other contemporary practices of intervention. Um, and there is tons of literature on these specific techniques and specific approaches that can be cultivated and learned. What I intend to do is to look a little deeper, delve a little into the how and why this kind of thing seems to work, and what might be the underlying ontology and epistemology that informs this. So I'll visit a few conceptual pieces. So the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that I believe there are two entirely different sort of modes of consciousness, which I call striving and abiding. The second thing I will talk about is a model of enactive cognition called the anticipatory present moment. The third thing I would like to talk about is an epistemological model that talks about these different modes of knowing that I was trying to describe in relation to the examples that I was talking about. And another epistemological model called the praxis learning cycle. so these are bits along with one or two other pieces that come together in what I have assembled, which I call an approach called immersive systemic knowing. If we have a little time, I'll just quickly sort of flash this model also at all of you. So I don't mind taking a pause now, just to understand, how things are. Am I clear? How's the flow of what I am saying? Are there any questions at this moment of time? Does anybody have any question?
Seems to be that there are not questions at this time. Well, this Jim Rowe is just saying that it's very clear. So I think that we should carry on.
All right,
Raghav,
all right. Thank you.
this is Abhay.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello, Abe. Hi.
Hi. So yeah, I just had a quick question. Maybe you may be talking about it later. Whatever you described in terms of your three examples and also later, but especially I'm referring to those examples. So as we all know that there is something called intuition.
Right.
There is something called subconscious cognition, which is not necessarily always interpreted through the rational frameworks of the brain, but there are other parts of the brain which function in certain ways and which process information in ways which are not necessarily at the level of consciousness. So whatever you described, can it also just be called intuition or subconscious processing, or is there something different that you're talking about?
See, Abhay, these are contested sort of areas, and there is no one accepted model which explains all of this very clearly. So, rather than say that all of it falls under intuition or all of it falls under, because, there is such a thing as bodily sensing. I mean, there are people who are trained in yoga or in theater or stuff like that. I feel something in my guts, or I feel a constriction in my heart, and I know where it is coming from. I know that this person is undergoing some fear or undergoing some, so I kind of am immediately able to translate that resonance of a bodily feeling into a message that somebody else is undergoing in their mind in that space. So there are various kinds of processes which operate, and I do not know whether all of them fall into any one of these buckets. But what I'm trying to do is look at certain models which still sort of look at this ontology and epistemology, and help us understand how using all of these various modalities can deepen systemic understanding.
John Lee has a comment. John, would you like to make your comment?
Of course. Thank you very much. It's really interesting. On your first point, my big point is you're challenging Western thought. People in India think about a lot of things. They think with their Hindu mind and they think with their British mind because they've had to do that to survive. But the society that existed before the Raj had a lot to do with how the people worked together, and they had nothing to do with money. So the world in India was a lot different than it is now. What you're reflecting is all the ways that people communicate that don't have anything to do with rational thought. But we have 40 million things going on in our mind at once, and we're only aware of a dozen of them. So what the Western mind is aware of leaves out most of what society is aware of. That's what I think you're addressing. Thank you.
Well, I mean, in a certain sense, it is my work with certain communities, certain kinds of people in India that have in some ways informed what I have picked up. But a lot of my understanding of this has come from various sources around the globe in the literature. and various models around the literature. And so this is not something that is specific to any one culture or civilization. It is just that, we have given excessive importance to rational thinking, scientific thinking, and in the process, we have lost our connectivity with certain other things that are latent in us. I think that's how it seems to be. But I mean, I myself belong to that category in the sense of the way I was educated and brought up in India. And if I hadn't gone to work with these communities, I suppose I would be entirely thinking only rationally and scientifically. So it is this clash of having to go there and unlearn what I knew and learning anew, afresh from people repeatedly. That is what has sort of pushed me in this direction. Yeah, so I'll carry on now. Um, so this is what is called the anticipatory present moment. It's an ontological model that is given by Anthony Hodgson, who has combined, futures thinking, anticipatory thinking, along with system sciences. And so this is a very complex model, and I am not going to go into all the details here. But essentially, what this is to point out is to say that exactly in the manner that we have, or that we, in the systems community understand the importance of feedback, we must understand that there are also processes of, anticipation and feed forward that can operate. And so part of our cognitive process also involves this sort of looking ahead and anticipating as part of the sense making and meaning making. Now, um, I think, before I go into that, let me talk about I mentioned that there are two modes of consciousness, and I think I would just describe that before I go into this a little more. Now, according to Western philosophy, consciousness operates from intentionality. So there is a certain intent with which we reach out. The mind reaches out, surveys the world, and filters the information in the light of that intentionality in order to make sense of it. Now, my argument is that that is only one half of the story. That is one orientation of consciousness, and I call that the striving orientation. Now, I believe that there is a second equally significant orientation, which I call the abiding orientation. So the striving orientation is an instrumental kind of approach. The abiding orientation is a generative approach. There is no goal seeking. There is no purpose. So there is simply an alert, aware relating to the world. There is no attempt to grasp anything specific, no attempt to accomplish any pre-existing intent. So I believe that both these orientations are very basic. They operate simultaneously, or they can operate simultaneously, but it is our, sort of focus in the modern Western sensibility on the striving rational approach with the power of science, with the power of rational thinking, and all that it has created for us and afforded us, that we've privileged the striving orientation, and we probably become oblivious to the operation of the abiding.
Fine. Just to...
Yeah, I think somebody needs to mute their mic. There's some crosstalk.
I'm doing that, don't worry.
So I think that, like Bateson described, our mind has connections with people and things outside of our physical body. And that there is a plenum or reservoir of information that in that shared space, that the shared mind can access in the abiding mode. So you need to be in the abiding mode. You need to be in a mode of paying attention, uh, paying total attention through various kinds of senses, including your bodily sensing, including your intuition. And this is what kind of explains the what happens in the theater activity, or how some of the other stories that I talked about, how that kind of understanding is generated. So uh, with that background, so what I would like to talk about, this model of the anticipatory present moment, is that um, it just decided to jump on its own. I'm sorry. Uh, is that anticipation, according to people in the futures thinking, people who've looked at this, the future sciences, is a very fundamental quality of sentient systems. So there are different theories about how it might happen, and some of them talk about the fact that there are alternate models to the linear conception of time. So there is a linear sense of time in which things happen, but there is also within our minds a sense of the timeless. Every encounter with the world carries both aspects to it. So in any encounter, in any reaching out to seeing the world, and especially if we are in the abiding mode of consciousness, we are aware of a certain timeless aspect of what it is that we are perceiving. And so, based on this timeless or non chronological experience of time, there is a possibility to anticipate and to, sort of construct multiple future scenarios. I mean, these multiple futures may not necessarily be compatible with each other, but they can be held in the consciousness of the present. And then in that consciousness, we can be open to the presence of choice and creative action to move towards one or the other of these scenarios. And, to, in a sense, affect the unfolding of the future. And there is a capacity of the mind to be firm in embracing this openness and this complexity of multiple possibilities of the future. And there is also a sort of capacity to hold responsibility for this choice concerning the unfolding future. So all of this are dimensions of anticipation that Anthony has described in this model. So it's essentially the takeaway from this is to say that uh, in the present moment we can anticipate the future, and this is how an active cognition is actually sort of happening. So I'll park discussion or explanation of this model here. There is quite a lot that actually one can discuss about the different elements that are mentioned here, but I will not go into all of those details. I will just move on to the next one, which is this epistemological model called the four ways of knowing that comes to us from Heron and Reason. They call this the participatory inquiry paradigm. And this is linked to all their work with the action research methodology called cooperative inquiry. Now, what this says is, in a sense, you can link this to a lot of what I have said in the preceding um, period. You see, what we are very, very aware of is, the thinking, the knowledge that uh, we generate when we apply our rational, logical, conceptual understanding to the reality. But uh, apart from this, there are other sort of three other categories of knowing apart from this rational category, which Heron and Reason describe. So um, uh, these three other forms are, if we start at the top, there is practical knowing that's put at the top of this diagram. This is about knowing how. I mean, how I type on my computer keyboard, or how I play the piano, or how I ride the bicycle is knowing that is held in my fingers or in my body and its sense of balance, rather than something that I am able to convert into rational explanation. So that's practical knowing. A propositional knowing we are familiar with. The third one coming down from the top is presentational knowing, which is essentially, it refers to all forms of creative expression, all the plastic and performing arts, where we're trying to represent the qualities and meanings and textures and emotive aspects of some experience through symbols and through comparing it with other categories, known categories. So that's how art and performing arts work. So that's presentational knowing. And experiential knowing is actually that impress on our mind in the very moment of the encounter. So it's completely unmediated. So whether it's a presentational or propositional or practical knowing, it has gone through certain filters and processes of our mind to achieve a certain form of output. But experiential knowing is just that absolute direct impress, which forms on our mind, and it's an apprehension or grasp of the world and its elements, and then we struggle to give it form and to clothe it, and so it often emerges as presentational knowing and propositional knowing. And the consummation of all our knowing is the practical, where we're able to do things with what we know. So that's why the Zaro going up saying consummating, but the ground of all our knowing is in the experiential knowing, and that's why the other arrow. So these are very sort of intimately connected to one another. These four forms of knowing uh, are not sort of discrete in any sense, and they flow into one another, but they are very distinct uh, modes of knowing. Now, there's another epistemological sort of model that I will talk about now, which is called the praxis learning cycle. So, how do we link our action and our thinking, our reflection? We have most of us are probably familiar with the Kolb's model, which is what essentially tries to talk about how we cycle in a praxis between action and reflection. But this model from again from Anthony Hodgson, I find it extremely evocative and much more closer to the complexity of the reality of how our experience eventually translates into practical knowing, cycling through presentational and propositional knowing. So essentially what he says is that there is a series of alternative modalities of learning, and they're linked through complex patterns. And the interesting thing about this model is that Tony talks about gateways, you know. He talks about gateways because there are challenges to reformatting and deepening what we know. And unless there is a certain unlearning and reformatting of what we know, we cannot assimilate certain aspects of our experience and enrich it enough to move further in the learning. And people who've tried to learn certain crafts and arts will be familiar with this a repeated cycling and unlearning and learning and reformatting that happens in that. Now, the term gateways kind of indicates that this progression is not automatic, but then there are certain sort of transition hazards to be negotiated, and it's only when those transitions take place that the learning moves into the next level. Uh, what has also been done here is that um, there are these sort of arrows which link different nodes, not in the normal linear, circular sort of path along which the learning is happening. And that's because this is where Tony is bringing in the connections between the various stages in terms of the timeless qualities, and what are also called time-bound qualities. So the time, in the chronological sense of learning, we are navigating the paths in a circular way, but across some of these, there is a certain sort of timeless understanding that is also developed. Apart from this, one key thing about this model is that it talks about three very key phases in all of this. So there is what is called learning at the screen, which means that we pick up something as ideas or concepts or basic understanding, and then we practice and apply it, which is called learning in the lab, and then we move on to actually putting it into application in the real world, displaying practical learning, and that's applying it in the world. So there are actually many rich sort of elements to this model, but I think this very briefly describes the key aspects of this. So I'll take a pause again once more. I have talked about three very rich models, each of which goes into several books, or there's a lot of rich literature in each of these. So each could do with one or two presentations, full presentations of this sort at Metaphorum. But I just wanted to very briefly flash these models. I'll take a pause now to invite any questions or reflections or comments or queries.
There was a question.
I'm not sure how to.
There was one question. Okay, Ian has a question, and
well, it's an observation, really. Hi, Rajav. Great to meet you. I've worked with Tony Hodgson for maybe 25 years. And the practice learning cycle is, of course, an Enneagram. And Tony has taken the Enneagram and used it as a process learning cycle, a transformational journey type cycle. Around the outside, of course, the do-re-mi is saying that when you go around, he said you go up an octave and the resonance goes up. He's done a course on that now, about that whole using the Enneagram in that context. And I think many people know the Enneagram as a personal typing tool, which is sort of all right, but I think as a process tool, it's much more powerful. And this one in particular, I think is very helpful. And I've loved your other work as well. Thank you for the session this evening. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. There was another comment from Paulo da Costa. Paulo, would you like to make your comment?
Oh, hi. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Paulo. Yes, very clear.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was just wondering about do you have any references for the theater games or experiments that you described? Is it Stanislavski or is it related to improv games? That was my question. Thank you.
Okay. No, so some of it comes from people like Stanislavski and all, but essentially what happened is that I worked at one point of time with a couple of theater groups in Chennai, in India, where I was living, and so the directors of those theater groups, they had all these various influences based on which they conducted these exercises. There was one particular theater director from Israel called Gil Allen, who came in and brought a whole lot of these exercises in. So for me, it was because I was actually uh, um, called in to help that theater group with their business. So I went in as an OD consultant to help them shape up their act and get their business going. But then I got exposed to this side of theater there. What I later found was that all theater groups practice variations. There are innumerable variations of these kinds of exercises, and they simply they abound, and every theater director is using various kinds of things when they're trying to put the team through the paces when they're planning to stage a new production.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
I don't know if Jim Rowe, would you like to make a comment, or was it just a comment in the chat?
Yeah, no, I just thought it was very interesting. There was a previous slide which had different levels of knowing, I think experiential and 3 other ones. And I was just wondering, so is wisdom the combination of all 4 ways of knowing, was my question really.
It's a bit of a difficult question. See, I mean, the way Heron and Reason postulated, what they say is that all the knowing, it should sort of eventually attain consummation. That the word that they use is consummation in practical wisdom, in practical knowing. But I have sort of read between their work and looked very carefully at what they're saying, and I believe that wisdom is the ground outside this, where the shared mind, where these theater exercises allow us to access what's there out in the group psyche, the collective knowing, or in somebody else's mind. So there is a ground or a field that seems to go beyond our the limitations of our physical form, and what the mind that we seem to believe is situated within this physical form, and various modalities for accessing that. That field of information that's all around. There are various kinds of techniques. I mean, I personally know that there are certain other kinds of things that you can access when you understand how energy healing takes place, or when you practice yoga, or when you practice certain forms of meditation. So I think that wisdom sort of doesn't lie just within what we create for ourselves in our mind, but it's there in a field from where we can access a lot of information. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just responding impromptu uh, to say how I am holding that.
Well, there is a chapter in the book in David Whitaker's book about the Stafford, Think Before You Think, that is called Strength. Yeah, and in that chapter, Stafford Beer explained his understanding of the relationship between information, knowledge, and wisdom from a cybernetic point.
Okay.
Is one of the beautiful things that I've ever read from Stafford. Very spiritual, very deep, and very interesting. If anyone wants to have a look on that, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Interesting.
Carry on. I don't think there's more questions.
Okay. So, yeah, I just wanted to share these pieces primarily. There are two other pieces that go into what I have assembled. So, finally, what I have kind of looked at is I've tried to see how these fit together. And this is what I've described as immersive systemic knowing, the model that I've tried to sort of playfully uh, put together in my book. And this is more sort of experimental and playful than anything. But if you looked at this circle here, then there is a sort of southeast. There's a tilted axis, so there is a sort of southeast hemisphere, and there is a northwest hemisphere, and so I see this as uh, the abiding kind of mode of consciousness is represented with these two frameworks that are here. So I've talked about the four ways of knowing. That's what this abbreviation stands for. I have not talked about this, which is what I call the deep intelligence field. That was another element in my book that I have described. These three are the ones that I had talked about. So this northwest sort of hemisphere is the striving modality of consciousness. So the anticipatory present moment and the praxis learning cycle, they sort of fit in here in my way of putting the scheme of things together. So to my mind, all of this is operating, simultaneously, and we are able to delve in and pick up certain pieces of it, or pay attention to certain pieces and not pay attention to certain pieces. But as we look around various approaches to knowing, that different cultures, different techniques, different sets of people, different epistemologies are put together, there seems to be a possibility of doing much more with an awareness of all of this. And that is what I think that's as systems thinkers, as systems practitioners, we should aim for. So I believe that what we have so far, by and large, in the trajectory of systems thinking, if we look at it from the point of view of those three waves that Gerald, eventually, or Michael Jackson and others have described, uh, they're all within broadly the framework of the modern rational thinking. So you have hard systems and soft systems and critical systems thinking. And to my mind, the next step, the next place to go is what I call transmodern systems thinking, because Ateljevic has described transmodernity as a phenomenon that is cropping up across many disciplines, many places, where what a lot of people are doing is combining the modern training and techniques and tools that they have with um, indigenous or traditional ways of knowing, and carefully sort of juxtaposing these to see whether we can arrive at deeper understanding. And I think that system scientists also need to uh, sort of push in these directions. So, I mean, with that, I'm finished. I've stated my case. So I think the floor is now open.
Well, thank you, Raghav. So I guess that we should invite people's comments. If anyone would like to engage in a conversation with Raghav, just
Okay, I'm not able to access chat while I'm on this mode of sharing the screen. It shows me that there are 16.
yeah, you can
Yeah,
close the screen.
yeah.
And stop
Yeah,
chat.
I know I have managed to open the chat window. Yes, may I stop the screen share?
Yes. Well, perhaps I will do a question, Raghav.
Yeah.
The title of your talk was Meta-Rational Ways of Knowing. Yeah. And when you
Yeah.
started, you did a really interesting introduction about the ways that you got interested in thinking about this meta-rational knowing. And then we have seen the theorization that you have done in your PhD about these different ways of knowing and think. But in particular, what do you consider that is this meta-rational? What is it what you consider that is the relevance of these meta-rational ways of knowing, or what is your hypothesis about the relevance of non-rational ways of knowing, in summary?
Right. I'll try to answer that, Angela. See, at one point when I described what I had experienced from the group inquiry methods that we had developed at or Indian organization for group inquiry called Sumedis, I had talked about the fact that there are phenomena which are very paradoxical, or which are, contrary to logical thinking. So if you look at individual psychology, if you look at the group processes, the group psychology that's operating within groups when you're doing group inquiry in that fashion. So what happens is that with a rational sort of tools and techniques, we can never cross the hurdle of these paradoxical dimensions that the natural world has, that simply exist in reality. Now, I can give you one practical example. See, one of the things that I did as an experiment at one time, in fact, as a project to understand the four ways of knowing, is that I apprenticed myself to a sculptor, a stone sculptor in India. And, these people work with granite, a very hard stone, and you have to chip at it with a hammer and a chisel. And now, with all my knowledge of physics and whatever other background I had of education and training, it seemed to me that I had to hold the chisel at a particular angle and hit it with a hammer in order to break the stone in a particular direction. And I could see that everybody in that workshop was holding it in the other way. It didn't make sense to me. I thought it would only damage the stone, and I kept at it for 2 or 3 days trying to get it my way. And I simply got utterly frustrated, and it just didn't make sense to me. And finally, at one point of time, I just decided to try the reverse, and I still don't have an explanation for why the reverse works, but it's the reverse that works. So rational thinking can often sort of blind us to the way certain processes or certain things unfold or operate. And so I think there are limits to what rational thinking can do. One other issue that has often come up in the discussion in the literature is about how do you deal with a situation where there is an absence of dialogue. If there is a complete standoff between two parties, and no means of rational dialogue is going to allow you to deal with that. And now I know very specific techniques. There is a theater technique called mirroring. Now, this is what the FBI uses to train its, they have very few people at the top-notch people who are assigned the job of speaking to people like somebody who's hijacked a plane and is ready to let off the bomb within 12 minutes or something like that. When you have a situation where you have to get somebody to come around, you have to speak to them, the only method that works is mirroring. It's a theater technique. So there are non-rational ways which also address issues like this.
Thank you, Raghav. Maya, you had a question, a comment?
Well, actually, part of my question was already answered by Raghav, because apologies for entering late. But my question is that there are different ways of knowing, and it will be great if we can have a dialogue between them, and especially between the experts in these different types of knowing. But in my humble experience, very often practical knowledge, the the knowledge of people that have hands-on professionals, for example, is the one that is very poorly rewarded in our, capitalist system. So I'm just wondering, is there any, like, have you experienced any sort of pushback to certain types of knowing, and how do you overcome this sort of kind of negative attitude towards some knowledge even is not considered knowledge? Very recently we're talking about indigenous knowledge, and we're going back to what we used to know, but until recently we used to think that, I mean, globally, I'm generalizing here, but we used to think that this indigenous knowledge is just illiterate and irrelevant. So how do we overcome this negative attitude?
Well, I have a very provocative answer to that. And, Gerald has heard me say this before. My answer is that it's precisely the arrogance of our current epistemology, which is mainstream, which has created the grotesque world that we have, the pinnacles of achievement that we believed were the capitalist model of economics, or the democratic model of governing nations, or whatever. A lot of these things are crumbling, and of course we have the ecological crisis, the climate crisis. Now I believe that the answers to these will not come from applying more of the same thinking. You have to look to the margins. And I've had a very sort of interesting experiences in this regard. There's the same tribal project where I worked, where I talked about the lift irrigation scheme. We had our international donor funding agency, pick up the topmost man in agriculture in India. He was the Director General of the topmost body for agriculture research. And as soon as he retired, they picked him up as a consultant on a very fat fee, and they sent him down to my project. And the first thing that he did on his first visit was to write a stinking report saying that the agriculture that these tribal farmers were practicing was primitive. And I nearly lost my job, but it just happened that I managed to hold on by the skin of my teeth. And we set up a challenge. I told him that, look, we'll give you 5 acres of land. It will be dealt with in precisely the manner that you give instructions about. And these 2 of my staff are dedicated to that, and you can monitor it any which way you please. And let's see after 1 year, what are the results from your plot of land and what are the results from our traditional farmers' plot of land. And after 1 year, he had to give a written report where he, swallowed his words. He ate humble pie, and he said that, yes, I did not realize it, but in the terrain and the topography and the soil and the other conditions here, the farmers seem to have optimized their method of agriculture far more than what we scientists know.
Well, thank you, Maya and Raghav. Anyone else would like to interact with Raghav at this point? Brian?
Okay, Gerald is raising his hand.
Somebody else was first.
Angela, can I say something?
Yes, please.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this really very interesting presentation. And for me, it was very special because since about 5 years, I'm doing experimental learning with my students. And one of the things that I realize is that when they come to me from the being for 3 or 4 years at a disciplinary university, they don't really understand that there are deeper layers of knowledge than just the university knowledge. So when they, for example, have to develop a conceptual model for a system that they're looking at, they stay totally at the surface because they cannot go down. And they don't understand that the epistemology that they have learned in their science, in biology, in oceanography or whatever, is limiting what they can actually discover. It takes a very long time. It's life transforming for the students, but finally, when they get to it, they see that there is so much more to understand than science lets us understand. And so I think what you said was very reconfirming for what we are doing and trying to get the people to, to evolve to a different way of looking at the world. They, for example, they come to me and have not really thought about that their perception is not a picture of the real world. It is what they think is the real world, and each of them has a different perception. And so I think what you are telling us is a very important story.
Yeah, Hans Peter, thank you for sharing that. I've actually, read and heard about a lot of people talk about the same kind of barrier, and it's very interesting because if you look at this group inquiry modality that we have developed in India, it started with, the kind of T group kind of approach that came in from the West, and where you sat and you mm, discussed in very rational terms about where I think I am and what I feel and what I think, and do you understand what I feel and do you think what I see, and getting tied up in knots of words. And from there it has moved into spaces and methods of exploration where, for example, I purely use theater activity, and we've practically done away with a rational talk or analysis. So everything has to be in the here and now. It's authentic action, it's authentic gestures. It's in theater. If somebody is in the middle of a room and enacting something, you just don't have to discuss whether it's coming through authentically or not. Everybody knows it. And so there are modalities. There's another colleague of mine who entirely uses yoga as a basis for exploration. And these kinds of exploration in the groups are so much far more enriching than all the T group modalities that we started with 2 decades ago. But that's precisely the challenge, that people find it very threatening to give up the way that they have been schooled with for 2 or 3 decades, and it's a bit of a challenge to make people give that up. But once you've experienced other modalities of knowing, and it's not to say that there's something wrong with rational or linear logic, or that it has to be discarded, but that it is limiting, and that to get a fresher and deeper connection with what you're seeing and experiencing, you have to let go of it for a bit and experience the other modalities before you understand how to harness all of them together.
If I may ask actually ask a question, one of the things that we are talking about is how we can address all those crises that we have created. I call them our in-world crisis. We have a problem of how we are in the world, and everybody comes up with solutions, and nobody has an epistemology to tell us that these solutions are going to work. So where do we get an understanding of which solutions would actually bring us to the future we want? And one of the reasons I ask this is that I don't like the term rational. I don't use it anymore. I use reason. It's a little bit based on Mercier and Sperber's Enigma of Reason. We have reason to talk to each other, not to be rational, but to find out what we want in the future. But how can we have an epistemology?
So I have been sort of grappling with the same thing, and one of the things that I have recently been thinking is that we seem to want to approach this in a very I don't know, for want of a better word, autistic fashion. I mean, if I am concerned about what we are doing to the forests or the rivers, and that's something that I want to carry into a discussion with a particular group. I mean, one of the first things I need to be able to do is to actually summon up and share the grief that I'm feeling. Now, if we bury that grief, if we bury those emotions, if we bury the rage, if we bury all of that, and then want to sort of simply talk with reason about what's the logical way to go, that is simply carrying on the same grotesque charade. I mean, so one of the things that we need to do is to rediscover these rituals of, coming together and sharing our vulnerability, sharing our uh, absence of answers, sharing our, loss in the face of these massive problems. And that has to be the starting point, not a sort of laundry list of 17 SDGs, which you shake into more and more complex kind of tables and graphs and charts. That has its place, certainly, but unless we're going to acknowledge the things that we have done and how we have hurt ourselves, um, we are not going to transcend this approach. I'm not very clear about this because this is emerging thinking, and I don't know whether it links to the word epistemology. But I'm more and more sort of because what we do in our group work is precisely to create spaces for these catharsis to happen. It's only when people are able to deal with the emotional baggage and dump it into that collective space where it is held and graced, that they can move on with what has been blocking and challenging them. And I think that the same must apply in the larger settings too.
Well, thank you very much. We have Elena and then Gerald. Yep.
Hi.
Hi, Elena.
I was wondering about how animals manage to do this, because they often make what we would consider very rational decisions, but they also have a lot of emotional intelligence, and they tend to know when something's wrong.
That's very interesting, Alina, that you say this, because one of the very interesting experiences that I've had is when I attended a training workshop on something called trauma healing. And this is something that a person called Peter Levine has put together. And, he's got this, I'm confusing and forgetting, but there's a book called Waking the Tiger or something like that. Where essentially what he's done is he studied animals, and he says that, see, at the core of our problem is that, the primal response that we have to encounters and experiences is the same as the animal. That limbic, that animal part of the brain is still at the core of everything. So there is a fight or flight kind of response that gets summoned, and there's a lot of emotional energies. There's a lot of psychic energy that's locked into that. But unfortunately, the kind of things that we face, the challenges. If I find that the democracy of my country is being taken over by a dictator, is not the same as facing a predator. So the challenge is diffuse, it is vague, and it doesn't go away. So these psychic energies keep getting locked in, and he's found this sort of technique of repeating what the animals do. So if there is a deer that is transfixed in the gaze of a tiger, a predator, and what it does is that it goes into freeze. But the moment the tiger moves away, then this animal, this deer or hare or whatever, it would go through a very elaborate shaking of its body. It would just do this thing with which all of that psychic energy is discharged. And now he has found a method of healing that involves this. And it is remarkable because the same 2004 tsunami, it also hit the coast in Tamil Nadu in a village called Nagapattinam. And there's a friend of mine from Bombay who traveled there and who was practiced in this. And, he narrates this story about an old woman there. And this has also been published in some journal. I have that reference somewhere in my thesis. So there was this lady who lost 22 of her family members in the tsunami. So she was shell-shocked. She was just sitting on a rock for 3 days before this trauma healing team arrived there. And all my friend needed to do was subject her to this trauma healing technique for 15 minutes. And then she just shook it all off, and she got up and she said, well, I just have to rebuild my house now. I need a place, I need a roof over my head. I need to create a place where I have to live again. So that's the power of some of these techniques. And there are these kinds of dimensions of our consciousness and of our response to threats and crises that we are completely unaware of. So there are several alternative healing techniques that tap into various of these psychodynamics, and thereby they affect their healing. So I don't think it's all sort of voodoo or mumbo jumbo, but it's just that the mainstream does not look at it adequately.
Thank you. And thank you for the rest of the presentation as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Gerald.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask whether you've got any reflections on the PhD process now, because I felt when you were doing your PhD, like this was a huge exercise in propositional knowing, and you had to present all this as propositional knowing. And the irony didn't escape me when you were doing your PhD. Yes. And I wonder if you've got any reflections on how it can be done differently.
I've even mentioned that irony, I think, in my preface or somewhere in my book, that, you do a very elaborate exercise in theoretical, propositional, philosophical exegesis in order to, say why practical knowing is important. But more than a reflection, what I seem to have come away with is the fact that I went on all cylinders, all 4 or 6 cylinders during those 3 years. It was nearly a sort of burnout kind of situation. One of the things that I contend with now, which is extremely peculiar, it's one of these paradoxes, that abound in nature, is that I used to be a bibliophile all my life. I devoured books. I could devour 3 books a day, 4 books a day. And of course, that must have reached its peak during my PhD. And after that, I find myself being extremely picky. I will only read something that's extraordinarily sort of interesting to me. So I find it very difficult to read these days. So I don't know what's that's been what the PhD has done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Yeah, this is Abhay. Yeah, so thanks, Raghav. I think it was really very insightful, and it has reiterated and also deepened, I think, many of the kind of trans-rational kind of modes of knowing, which we all are grappling with and also try to understand. And I have, it's more of an observation that one reason why propositional knowing gets privileged is because it allows widespread sharing and communication. In the sense that other forms of knowing are less amenable to sharing, or at least not in the forms that we know. So probably it's possible to share in a small group, experiential learning, or maybe also certain kinds of practical learning if you're directly interacting in a group or person to person. But when it comes to wider sharing and communication, at a whatever in a much larger audience, let us say, which may not be physically present in the same space, and which is some sort of a advantage. I'm not saying that is necessarily the only way in which sharing should take place, but so for example, what you did just now, you made a presentation, and people sitting across the world could understand and relate to with what you're saying. So the ability to communicate widely across even direct interaction in multiple audiences, multiple places, who are not even directly personally interacting with each other, propositional knowing has some advantage there. Again, I'm not saying that should be
Absolutely. I mean, of course, there has been a lot written about this as to how the advent of printing technology was something that absolutely changed the world. But I have some sort of doubts about this, in the sense that, I have, while I was working in Igatpuri with those tribal farmers, one of those Kumbh Melas at Trimbakeshwar happened. And I saw how, vast multitudes, several millions of people passed by, and how they were housed and fed, and all of that happened with among the entire population of 25 villages who were illiterate. They couldn't even write down lists of how much to cook and how many people to provide sleeping space for, or whatever. And if you look at the history of the native indigenous people in America before it was colonized. Now they had numerous tribes, but they also had that sense of a nation where all of these people came together and worked as one, or shared certain dimensions as one. So I mean, I wonder about this, because I don't know enough about how all of that happened or how it worked. But an interesting thing for you to look up and to read would be, this book by David Abram called The Spell of the Sensuous. It's a very interesting work, because David Abram is a sleight of hand magician from America. And he just decided to travel to Asia, on vacation. But he said that while I'm there, let me just look at how magic is done in these communities. And then, to his kind of shock and horror, he discovered that in places like Nepal and Philippines and all that, magic occupies a completely different space. It's not mere, entertainment where people know that it's all rationally explained, and it exists merely as some sleight of hand. I mean, people actually have a magical kind of connect with nature, with the supernatural. They have, and he looked at all of this, and he looked at, what it is that we have lost, because we have no sense of wonder at the mystery, at the beauty, at the vastness of nature. We have lost all of that. We have become very, very sort of sterile in our minds. And he has a proposition. He says that what has happened is that all that sense of magic has entered the printed word. So when we see something in print, we respond to it as if it's magical.
Okay, thank you, Abhay and Raghav. We have the last question from Louis. And
Okay.
I think that we
Actually, I had not completed. I was just wanting to say that how do we communicate other forms of knowing?
Right. Yeah.
That is a challenge. So I was not saying that we should only do propositional knowing.
No. If it were not for if it were not for the coronavirus and the need to get on Zoom and do all this virtual thing. I mean, what I personally prefer always to do is not talk shops but workshops. Where I put people through the paces. Small little theater activities, this and that. I mean, you have to taste it to the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So rather than talk about it or celebrate about it, people have to go through the experience. I mean, this is what we do in our labs. I mean, people come in to deal with their existential crisis and problems. And we don't discuss it at all. We just put them through their pieces of theater, and they solve it and go away in 4.5 days. But I mean, there are different approaches, different techniques. So, Hans Peter was talking about how he's evolved a method of working within a college system, within a university system, where he's still getting people to go that level deeper. So there are all these action research techniques. There are very, very, very pedagogies that work in different ways. But my way is simply to directly use theater, use yoga, go into a workshop mode, and give people a taste of what they can access by suspending their rational or the operation of their rational reasoning mind, and by experiencing something else. That's been my approach.
Okay, well, last question from Louis.
Hi, Louis.
Oh, hi there. I'm actually thinking given the time, that probably now is not the time to say anything, because I'm assuming everybody's meant to be finishing at 18:30. So I have a great capacity to show up right at the end, and I don't actually want to do that and disrupt the entire proceedings. So I think I'll lay it down and maybe have a conversation with Raghav outside of this session. So apologies.
Yeah, well, it's great to see you and say hi after a very long time, Louis, and I hope you're doing well.
Yes, lovely to see you, Louis, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Right. Well, in that case, I think that we will conclude the session. I think that is been really interesting. There are lots and lots of questions. I'm sure that we will live with. But there is really interesting scope for continuing research in this place, and I think that in general, for systems and cybernetics, the issue of understanding knowing, the way that we know, and going behind rational thinking is definitely something very core, and I'm pretty sure that there is a huge scope for developing new forms of knowing, much more systemic, much more holistic, going further from just the only traditional ways of knowing, and talking and expressing our knowing, as I was saying. It's just not only about what do we know, but how can we express our knowing, and definitely lots of things to think about. So thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you all of you for being with us again today.
Thank you, everybody who's graced this space and time with your presence and all your questions and dialogue. It's been absolutely lovely meeting all of you and talking to all of you. And yes, let's keep this conversation and let's keep pursuing these questions. Thank you, Angela. Thanks to Metaphorum for the opportunity.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chandra.